Because the baseline condition of life is something like unbearable suffering. Is something like unbearable suffering. And what you have to set against that is a noble and worthwhile purpose. A noble and worthwhile purpose. Hopefully your determination of that purpose is buttressed to some degree by the wisdom of the past, because you can't conjure something like that up on your own. And if you provide people with nobility of purpose, then they can tolerate the suffering of existence without becoming entirely corrupted by it. And cultures that don't do that, it isn't even so much that they die, it's that cultures that don't do that are dead. They're done. They don't have a story anymore, and they don't have a call to adventure. And then, well, then everyone suffers stupidly as a consequence. It's a very bad thing. Bring the story forward and propagate it and make it the most noble possible story. And then you motivate people to transcend themselves, which they need to do. People think of freedom as the ability to implement your whim. And freedom opens up that as a possibility. But sustainable freedom, that isn't what it's about at all. It's primarily about responsibility. It's about determining which load you're going to pick up and carry. That's the proper definition of appropriate freedom. They can't organize themselves across time. They can't sacrifice the moment for the future. And the more sophisticated you get, I suppose, in some sense, the more you're able to do that. And then your freedom becomes wagging sort of way. It's like, well, you're breaking the rules, you're a bad person. And well, that may be true. The proper message for young people is to say, well, no, you don't understand. You want to take on responsibility. You want to take on the heaviest load that you can conceive of, that you might be able to move, because it gives your life nobility and purpose. And that offsets the tragedy, offsets the tragedy, offsets the tragedy, offsets the tragedy. And not only psychologically, because you have a purpose and something to wake up for, to face the difficulties of the day, but also because if you face the difficulties of the day properly, you actually ameliorate suffering, not only in the psychological sense, but because you make the world at least a less terrible place. And that's something. And that's something. Right? To move things away from hell is something. To move things away from the worst they can be is, well, that's a noble goal in and of itself. There's a lot of really good things going on in the world. We have poverty, absolute poverty, between the year 2000 and 2012. Hundreds of thousands of people are being connected to the power grid every day. Fresh water is available not to fewer and fewer people, but to more and more people. That's happening extremely rapidly. Starvation in India and China is a thing completely of the past. You never hear about that. And that's pretty much the case for the rest of the world, except now and then for political reasons. You know, everybody's got a cell phone, and anybody who doesn't is going to have one in the next 10 years. And that puts in people's hands a degree of communication and access that would have been absolutely incomprehensible even 15 years ago. All these good things are happening. And just concentrating on this polarization process that seems to have gripped us in the West seems counterproductive given all those good things that are going on in the background. Now, that doesn't make what's going on in the West trivial, but it does set it inside a much more positive context, so that's something to keep in mind.
mind.
Freedom of speech, the right to freedom of speech is central because it's the right by which you defend all the other rights. Well, that's why the idea of logos in the West is the most sacred concept. Christ, think about this psychologically, Christ is the ideal of perfection. This is independent of any religious discussion or any historical accuracy. It doesn't matter. What Christ represents is the perfect individual. Whatever that is. Now, you discuss endlessly what that is, but one of the things the West has settled on is that the perfect individual utters the truthful speech that makes potential into habitable order. Does that through truth. That's embedded in the first few sentences of Genesis, for example. God brings the world into being. And the idea that that truthful speech that brings the world into being from formless potential also characterizes each person. That's our fabrication in the image of God. That's the idea of the West. It's an unbelievably remarkable idea that perfection, individual perfection, is to be found in a relationship with spoken truth. God, that's the great idea. Well, it's out of that arises the observation that there's nothing more central to the hierarchy of rights and obligations as well, let's say, than freedom of speech. Yes, it's absolutely central. That's why Christ is the Word made flesh. The idea is that the perfect individual is the person who speaks truth, but also acts out the truth of those words. It's a proposition whose merit is virtually self-evident when you understand it in that manner. So yeah, to see assaults on freedom of speech, especially compelled speech, well, that's where I drew the line in my life. It's like, that is the West. It's logocentric. If you want to take the West down, you remove the idea of the divine word from the substructure of the society. So you have to do that. It's like, and this is the level at which this war is being fought. It's fundamentally a theological war.
Question?
I married young and have had only one sexual partner. Now I desire variety, but value my marriage and will not cheat. Any insight on overcoming this conflict? As a matter of fact, yes. I would say, get the variety with your partner. You know, there's lots of games you can play to spice up your sexual life. Buy some lingerie, like buy 100 pieces. You know, buy whatever you need that you might want to experiment with. You have to introduce that spirit of pretend play that you had when you were a little kid into your sexual life, and then you have many partners in the same person. Put some thought into it. Sex is a domain in which expertise can be developed just like any other domain. Some of that's play and fantasy play. Some of it's sexual technique. And I guess then the other thing I would say is take stock of each other and see if there are things that you could do in your life that would make you more attractive to one another. You know, those are hard questions because no one wants to say, well, you know, I'd be more attracted to my wife sexually if she just acted X way. And the same with regards to a wife's contemplation of her husband. But those are the real questions, man. If your partner isn't acting in a manner that is sexually attractive, then either there's something wrong with you or there's something wrong with them. Those harsh judgments that your sexual attraction makes are also very useful ways of orienting yourself towards proper behavior in the world. Admit to the variety that you want and see to what degree you can fulfill that within the confines of the marriage. It's also part of coming into contact with the shadow, I would say, if you want to look at it from a Jungian perspective. You might have all sorts of sexual desires that part of you feels should remain taboo. And maybe they should. I'm not suggesting absolute sexually libertine behavior. Maybe they should. I know sexuality has to be regulated very carefully. might be able to push yourself with some time and effort and contemplation and some admission of fantasy and all of that into domains of sexual satisfaction that you haven't achieved before. I try to do this all the time. I want the best for what wants the best in you. It's like that part, I'm that part's friend. It's like I don't have unconditional positive regard. I am not on the side of you that's aiming at your defeat. I'm not at all on that side. I'm on the side of you that's struggling towards the light, right? And I'm on the side of that part of me. At least I'm trying to be on the side of that. And that's the definition of love. And that's the definition of love, I believe. Because what it means is, but I said it. I truly want the best for what wants the best in you. Yeah. And people love that. They love that, man. I'm trying to figure out what's the best for us. Really, the best. Not the best for me, although that's part of it. Because here I am, you know, and I'm in the game too. I'm so greedy, let's say. I don't just want the best for me. That's not enough for me. I'm too greedy for that. Maybe I'm too selfish for that. I want the best for me in a way that's the best for everyone else too. Because that's even better. That's another interesting thing about being bounded by death. You have nothing to lose. You might as well aim for the highest goal, because what have you got to lose that you aren't already going to lose? Nothing. Nothing. And you have everything, hypothetically, to gain. If you want to go to university and become a physician, there's a lot of sacrifice of impulsive gratification that goes along with that. But if you become a physician, then it's a noble enterprise, people support you socially, and all of the needs that you need to have fulfilled will also be fulfilled by that enterprise. Well, that's a way better model. It's strange that the maximum freedom comes with the adoption of a discipline and then also the adoption of responsibility. That frees you up and everyone else around you in the long run. And if you explain that to people, especially in this day and age when they've been fed a never-ending diet of idiot rights and freedoms, they're immediately on board with it because they know that most of the meaning that people experience in their life is a consequence of adopting responsibility. So they're starving for that. They're starving for that. The idea to be articulated. It's as if something like the following happened as humanity developed. First were the endless tens or hundreds of thousands of years prior to the emergence of written history and drama. During this time, the twin practices of delay and exchange begin to emerge slowly and painfully. Then they become represented in metaphorical abstraction as rituals and tales of sacrifice, told in a manner such as this. It's as if there's a powerful figure in the sky who sees all and is judging you. Giving up something you value seems to make him happy, and you want to make him happy because all hell breaks loose if you don't. So, practice sacrificing and sharing until you become expert at it, and things will go well for you. No one said any of this, at least not so plainly and directly, but it was implicit in the practice and then in the stories.
Shit is wow.
Action came first, as it had to, as the animals we once were could act, but could not think. People watched the successful succeed and the unsuccessful fail for thousands and thousands of years. We thought it over and drew a conclusion. The successful among us delay gratification. The successful among us bargain with the future. A great idea begins to emerge, taking ever more clearly articulated form, ever more clearly articulated stories. What's the difference between the successful and the unsuccessful? The successful sacrifice. Things get better as the successful practice their sacrifices. The questions become increasingly precise and simultaneously broader. What is the greatest possible sacrifice for the greatest possible good? And the answers become increasingly deeper and profound. The God of Western tradition, like so many gods, requires sacrifice. But sometimes he goes even further. He demands not only sacrifice, but the sacrifice of precisely what is loved best. We'll start our analysis with a truism. Stark, self-evident, and understated. Sometimes things do not go well. That seems to have much to do with the terrible nature of the world, with its plagues and famines and tyrannies and betrayals. But here's the rub. Sometimes when things are not going well, it's not the world that's the cause. The cause is instead that which is currently most valued, subjectively and personally. Why? Because the world is revealed to an indeterminate degree through the template of your values. Thus, if the world you're seeing is not the world you want, it's time to examine your values. It's time to rid yourself of your current presuppositions. It's time to let go. It might even be time to sacrifice what you love best so that you can become who you might become instead of staying who you are. Something valuable given up ensures future prosperity. Something valuable sacrificed pleases the Lord. What is most valuable and best sacrificed? Or what is at least emblematic of that? A choice cut of meat, the best animal in a flock, a most valued possession. What's above even that? What constitutes the ultimate sacrifice for the gain of the ultimate prize? It's a close race between child and self. The sacrifice of the mother offering her child to the world is exemplified profoundly by Michelangelo's great sculpture, Pieta. Michelangelo crafted Mary cradling the nearly naked body of her adult son, crucified and ruined. It's her fault. It was through her that he entered the world and its great drama of being. Is it right to bring a baby into this terrible world? Every woman asks herself that question. Some say no, and they have their reasons. Mary answers yes, voluntarily, knowing full well what's to come. As do all mothers, if they allow themselves to see. It's an act of supreme courage when it's undertaken voluntarily. In turn, Mary's son, Christ, offers himself to God and the world to betrayal, torture, and death
to the very point of despair on the cross, where he cries out those terrible words, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? That is the archetypal story of the man who gives his all for the sake of the better, who offers up his life for the advancement of being, who allows God's will to become manifest fully within the confines of a single mortal life. That is the model for the honorable man. In Christ's case, however, as he sacrifices himself, God, his Father, is simultaneously sacrificing his Son. It is for this reason that the Christian sacrificial drama of Son and Self is archetypal. It's a story at the limit, where nothing more extreme, nothing greater can be imagined. That's the very definition of archetypal. And that's the core of what constitutes religious. Pain and suffering define the world. Of that, there can be no doubt. Sacrifice can hold pain and suffering in abeyance to a greater or lesser degree. And greater sacrifices can do that more effectively than lesser. Of that, there can be no doubt. Everyone holds this knowledge in their souls. Thus, the person who wishes to alleviate suffering, who wishes to rectify the flaws in being, who wants to bring about the best of all possible futures, who wants to create heaven on earth, will make the greatest of sacrifices, of self and of child, of everything that is love, to live a life aimed at the good. He will forego expediency. He will pursue the path of ultimate meaning, and he will, in that manner, bring salvation to the ever desperate world.
Archetypal themes are archetypal because they actually speak of the structure of human experience. That's why they last. And human experience has a pattern. You don't have the capacity to articulate that pattern as an individual, in part because your life is too short. You just can't figure it out. But the ancient representations of those patterns are everywhere around you. You know some of them in image. You cotton onto them automatic. You fall into them if you go to a movie, for example, because movies always express archetypal themes. If you hear them articulated, you think, I knew that. I knew that. I knew that. I knew that. That's the Platonic idea of learning as remembering. Your soul already knows, but it doesn't have the words. And so, when people talk to me about watching my lectures, they say one of two things. A quarter of them say, when I listen to you talk, it's as if you're telling me things that I already know. It's like, yeah, well, that's exactly right, because that's what archetypal stories are. They're the description of what you already know. But that can be articulated, and then who you are and how you see yourself and the way you describe yourself all become the same thing. So that's wonderful. Then you're not at odds with yourself. You're a functioning unity, and that makes you much stronger and more indomitable than you would otherwise be. And then the other thing that people say, and this is more like 3/4 of them, is that they say, I was in a very dark place. I was addicted. I was drinking too much. I had a fragmented relationship with my fiancée, and I wasn't getting married. Things weren't going very well with my family. My relationship with my father was damaged. I didn't have any aim. I was wasting my time. Some variant of that, some combination of those. And they said, well, I've been watching your lectures. I've decided to establish a purpose. I'm trying to tell the truth, and things are way better. Let's say I've done maybe 8 large-scale public talks in the last 2 months, 20,000 people, and about a third to half of them have stayed afterwards to talk to me, so that's about 7 who have said that to me. And then people stop me on the street all the time and tell me exactly that story, which is just, you can't imagine how good it is to be able to go to places you've never been and to have people stop you on the streets. Well, look, my life is way better than it was. It's like, it's so good. And I've got like, I don't know, 35,000 letters from people. More than that, I can't keep track. It's exactly the same thing. A quarter of them say, well, you've given me the words to say what I already knew was true, and thank you for that. My father, he's 81. I put him in charge of going through my viewer email, which is an overwhelming job, but he's overwhelmed by the fact that so many people are writing and saying the same thing. I have a purpose, man. My life actually matters. I finally realized that, and I'm putting it into practice. And I'm bearing up under the heaviest load I can imagine, and it's really helping. Like God, that's tens of thousands of responses now. You couldn't hope for anything better. There's zero harm in it, right? It's just people putting their lives together. They're not mucking about with other people. They're not trying to make broad-scale social transformations about which they have no idea. They're trying to make their immediate environment better. And it's working. A journalist asked me why people are responding so positively to what I'm saying, the young men, for example, and I thought, why, yeah, that's a good question. Well, I'm actually on their side. I'm really happy that they're not wasting their lives. I'm really sad to see that people are disenchanted and nihilistic and depressed and anxious and aimless and perverse and vengeful and all of those things. It's terrible. And then to see people question whether that's necessary and then to start to rise out of it, it's like, it's so fun. Like last night I was after my talk, it's overwhelming. It's overwhelming. Think about these things, but I was after my talk last night, and so all these people line up. You know, they have their 15 seconds with me, and they're kind of tentative. They're excited and tentative when they come up to talk to me, and then they have, 15 seconds of time to tell me something. I'm really listening to them. They're hesitant about whether or not to share the good news about their life, and I think it's often because when people share good news about their life, people don't necessarily respond positively. They don't get encouragement. And people need so little encouragement. It's just unbelievable. And so they'll tell me something good, and I think, oh, that's so good. Somebody says, oh, I'm getting along way better with my father. I haven't seen him for 10 years, and now we get along. It's like, God, great. Yeah. And then the power of that, you can't overstate the power of that for individuals to get their life together. The individual's an unbelievably powerful force, and every single person who gets their act together a little bit has the capacity to spread that around. It's a chain reaction. It's a chain reaction.
Human beings are weird creatures because we're much more activated by having an aim and moving towards it than we are by attainment. And what that means is you have to have an aim, and that means you have to have an interpretation. It also means that the nobler the aim, the better your life. And that's a really interesting thing to know because, you've heard ever since you were tiny that you should act like a good person. You shouldn't lie, for example. And you might think, well, why the hell should I act like a good person and why not lie? Even a 3-year-old can ask that question because smart kids learn to lie earlier, by the way. Why not twist the fabric of reality so that it serves your specific short-term need? That's a great question. Why act morally? If you can get away with something and it brings you closer to something you want, why not do it? These are good questions. It's not self-evident. Well, you destabilize yourself and things become chaotic. That's not good. That's not good. And if you don't have a noble aim, that's not good. That's not good. That's not. And that's not good. Because life is so difficult, it's so much suffering, it's so complex, it ends, and everyone dies, and it's painful. It's like without a noble aim, how can you withstand any of that? You can't. You become desperate, and once you become desperate, things go from bad to worse very rapidly. And so there's the idea of the noble aim. It's something that's necessary. It's the bread that people cannot live without, right? It's not physical bread. It's the noble aim. It's the noble aim. And what is that? Well, it's to pay attention. It's to speak properly. It's to confront chaos. It's to make a better world. To make a better world. Make a better world. Make a better world. It's to make a better world. That's enough of a noble aim so that you can stand up without cringing at the very thought of your own existence. So that you can do something that's worthwhile to justify your wretched position on the planet. We each must avoid falling prey to the temptation of identifying with the chaotic, depressing, anxiety-ridden, and nihilism-inducing state of affairs engendered by the terrible confrontation with the genuinely unknown. Even when thrust into the underworld by the dread events of our life, we must not characterize ourselves as permanent inhabitants of that dark and dread place, lest we lose hope, despair, and seek revenge. To progress psychologically, you must let go, sacrifice, time and again in the face of successive obstacles. You must abandon those things that, and often those people who, are impeding your progress, despite the fact that you may have held them very close to your heart. When you're wrong, when you've missed the mark, when you've sinned, because that is the meaning of sin, you must let the part of you that is wrong and aiming improperly die. Then you must allow the new spirit manifesting itself within to spring to life. That new spirit, that's the terrible information contained in whatever error you committed, in living conjunction with the now transformed structures you originally employed to frame the situation. That new spirit, it's a manifestation as well of the potential within you that had not yet been called forth by the previous travails of your life. Christ is symbolically the way and the truth of life, and no one comes to the Father except through him. Embracing the process of voluntary death and rebirth that is identical with psychological development means determining to move forward and upward despite the horrors of life. It means as well, symbolically speaking, rejuvenating the dead father, or rescuing him from stagnation and deterioration in the eternal underworld. We are all the slaves of Pharisees and lawyers, of those who place dogma above spirit at the cost of spirit. We are all subject to betrayal by ourselves and by all those who surround us. We are all facing extinction in the most torturous of manners. But there is a spirit within us with sufficient courage to confront the true horrors of existence forthrightly, to allow the transformation, even death. embracing its fate. We are all fallen creatures, and we all know it. We are all separated from what should be and thrown into the world of death and despair. We are all brutally crucified on the cross that is the reality of life itself. To rebel against that fate merely worsens it, transforming what could be mere tragedy into something indistinguishable from hell. To argue bitterly and despair around the deathbed of a loved one is to turn all the pain of death and loss into something far worse. To accept instead? Is that simultaneously to transcend? It's certainly courage and truth and perhaps even love, and these three forces are something to behold. Are they more powerful than despair and the desire for vengeance? That is the Christian suggestion. And the Christian command? To act out the proposition that courage and truth and love are more powerful than death and despair. And to accept what transpires as a consequence.
Akira.
You got to be oriented towards something, because otherwise you're disoriented. You just spin around in circles, and then you suffer, and so do people around you. It's not a good solution. Orient yourself towards something. You have to figure out what it is. What will work for you? What goal would justify the suffering of your life? Start trying to piece that together. You're going to get better at it. But it's a personal process. So you need a personal place to stand, because otherwise you're going to be handed a place to stand on a plate. And it may be one that makes you a puppet of someone else's goals. So I would say, you know, what are the processes? Well, I think what I've recommended to people is clean up your room. 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 That's a good start. Organize your local landscape. Schedule your time. Start taking control of yourself. See if you can stop saying things you know to be lies. That's not the same as telling the truth. You don't get to do that to begin with, because you're not good enough at it to even attempt it in some sense. But everyone can stop saying things they know to be falsehoods. Stop saying things that violate your conscience. Here's another idea. Stop saying and doing things that make you feel weak. So all you have to do is pay attention to that. Some things you do will make you feel disintegrated. It's a physiological sensation. Some things improve your integrity, and some things disintegrate you. Now, the things that disintegrate you, you often do to impress other people, or because you're taking a shortcut, or you're escaping what you know to be your moral obligation. And your moral obligation stems naturally from your aims. And if you don't have an aim, well, then you're aimless. So that's not a solution. So along with the aims come the moral obligations. Then when you violate the moral obligations, you'll have a sense of that violation. It's like, well, you have to stop doing that. Or that's something you could do. You don't have to. You don't have to do any of this. But I would say that's where people should start. You start small. Clean up your room. Clean up your room. Clean up your room. Clean up your room. I had a girl come up to me last night. She said, I started cleaning up my room, and it completely changed my life. She said, your room is an externalization of your mind. And that's right. That's exactly true. To the degree that you're in your room, the room is you. Now, that's how people think, but that's okay. It doesn't matter if they think that way. That's how it is. So, straighten up what you can straighten up, and quit saying things that make you feel weak. And then
then you'll know what to do next. Figure out. You sit on your bed one morning and say, okay, there's some things that need to be done that I don't want to do, that I could do, that would make things better by the end of the day. What are they?
Question?
Your conscience will deliver those suckers in no pine flat, man. And then you might have to say, okay,
Question?
how do I entice myself into doing a few of those? If you ask, instead of trying to force yourself to do it like you're a tyrant and a slave at the same time, you can usually negotiate with yourself so that you'll start to sort those things out. Sort them out. Put your house in order. And then move on. Move on. Move on. Yeah. The thing is, you have a practice domain. There are things that are within your grasp that you could fix. Fix them, and you'll learn. It will make you grow very, very rapidly, and then you'll be able to sort out more complex problems without making them worse. Well, my sense is that if you want to change the world, you start from yourself and work out through it, because you build your competence that way. It's like, I don't know how you can go out and protest the structure of the entire economic system if you can't keep your room organized.
Yeah, isn't that an issue with people, though, that they always want to enact some sort of control over the outside world when their inside is all fucked up?
Well, I think there's some truth in that. I think there is truth in that. I mean, people try to change the outside world for lots of ways, but many of those ways aren't just pure good. I was trying to produce something that was a counterposition to this idea that what you should do is go out and fix up other people. You know, that's just not right. And then there's a New Testament line about that, something about, you know, not worrying too much about the speck in your neighbor's eye when you have a log in your eye. It's like, yes, no kidding, yes, no kidding, yes, no kidding, yes, 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 no kidding, yes, no kidding, yes, no kidding, yes, 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 no kidding. Let's say you want to sort out your room and beautify it. And let's say that all you have is just a little room, like you're not rich, but you've got your damn room and you've got this space right in front of you that's a part of the cosmos that you can come to grips with. Well, a room is a place to sleep. And so if you set your room up properly, then you figure out how to sleep and when you should sleep and how you should sleep. And you figure out when you should wake up. And then you figure out, well, what clothes you should wear, because they have to be arranged properly in your dresser. And then you have to have some place to put your clothes. If you're going to have some clothes, you have to figure out what you're going to wear those clothes to do, right? And then that means you have to figure out what you're going to do. And then your room has to serve that purpose, because otherwise it doesn't set up properly. And if it doesn't serve your purposes, you will be unhappy and not happy in the room, because the way that we perceive the world is as a place to move from point A to point B in. And so what it means to set up your room is that you have to have somewhere to go that's worthwhile. The next thing is, well, maybe you have to make it beautiful, but that's not easy, right? That means you have to have some taste, and that doesn't mean you have to have money. It doesn't, because you can be garish with money, and you can be tasteful with nothing. You have to be creative in order to do that. So then to beautify your room means that you also have to develop your capacity to be creative. And so then you can make your room shine. But then what will happen is that if your family isn't together, they will interfere with that. And you start building this little microcosm of perfection. It'll evoke all the pathologies of everyone in your household. They'll wonder what the hell you're up to in there. And they won't necessarily be happy, because if they're in a lowly place, the higher you move out of that, the more the place they're in looks bad. And you might say, well, what they should do is celebrate your victory over chaos and evil, but that isn't what will happen. What will happen instead is that they will attempt to pull you back down. And so what that means is that if you organize your room, then you're going to have to confront the devils in your house. And that's often a terrifying thing, because some of those devils have lineages that go back many, many generations. And God only knows what you have to struggle with in order to overcome that. And so to sort yourself out and to fix up your room is a non-trivial matter, you know. We need to know who the competent people are, and we need to warn them. And even more importantly, we need to tell young people, hey, there's some hierarchies of competence out there. Like 1,000 of them. Go be a plumber, man. But be a good one, you know? Be an honest one. Because otherwise all you do is go out there and cause trouble. We don't need people to cause more trouble. We need people to solve problems. Solve problems. Solve problems. We need people to solve problems. Solve problems. Solve problems. We don't need people to cause more trouble. We need people to solve problems. Solve problems. Solve problems. Go be a plumber, man. Go be a plumber, man. Be a good one, you know? Tradesman, and you can make a lot of money as a tradesperson. It's a bloody, reliable, honorable, forthright, productive way of making a living. And there is a hell of a lot of difference between a working man who knows what he's doing and one who doesn't. Both in terms of skill and ethics, right? And you work with someone who knows what they're doing, it's a bloody pleasure. They tell you what they're going to do. They tell you how much it will cost. They go and do it, it works, and you pay them. Perfect. Everyone's happy. And that's what happens when you have genuine hierarchies of competence. Utopian comfort and certainty. They want adventure and chaos and uncertainty. And so that the very notion of a utopia was anti-human, because we're not built for static utopia. We're built for a dynamic situation where there's demands placed on us and where there's the optimal amount of uncertainty. Very frequently what I'm doing as a therapist is helping people have a life that would work, you know, and you can parameterize that. It's like, what do you need? How about some friends? That people kind of like that. How about an intimate relationship with someone that you can trust, that maybe has a future? That'd be good. How about a career that puts you in a dominance hierarchy somewhere, so at least you've got some possibility of rising, some possibility of stabilizing yourself, and a schedule and a routine, because no one can live without a routine. You just forget that. If you guys don't have a routine, I would recommend, like, you get one going, because you cannot be mentally healthy without a routine. You need to pick a time to get up, whatever time you want, but pick one and stick to it, because otherwise you dysregulate your circadian rhythms and they regulate your mood. And eat something in the morning. I've had lots of clients who've had anxiety disorders. I had one client who was literally starving. Very smart girl. It was very little that she liked.
Would you sing one of my favorite numbers, Autumn Leaves? Oh, I will be glad to.
particularly alcoholics, that does in a lot of people. You need a family, like the family you have, your parents and all that. It'd be nice if you all got along, you could work on that. That's a good thing to work on. And then, you know, you probably need children at some point. That's life. That's what life is. And if you're missing, you know, you may have a good reason to not be operating on one of those dimensions. It's not mandatory, but I can tell you that if you're not operating reasonably well on 4, I think I mentioned 6, if you're not operating reasonably well on at least 3 of them, there's no way you're going to be psychologically thriving. And that's more pragmatic in some sense than psychological, right? Human beings have a nature. There's things we need. And if we have them, well, that's good. And if we don't have them, well, then we feel the lack. And so behaviorists, behavioral psychologists concentrate a lot more on that sort of thing. You know, it's practical. Strategize. Make a career plan. Figure out how to negotiate, because that's bloody important. Figure out how to say what you need. Figure out how to tell the truth. Figure out how to listen to your partner in particular, because if you listen to them, they will actually tell you what they want, and sometimes you can give it to them, and maybe they'll return the favor, and if you practice that for like 15 years, well, then maybe you're constantly giving each other what you want. Well, hooray, that would be good. And then there's 2 of you, under most circumstances, and it's better to have 2 brains than 1. Because people think differently because of their temperament, mostly. And so the negotiation is where the wisdom arises. And it's part of the transformation, the psychological transformation that's attendant on an intimate relationship. And one of the fundamental purposes of a long-term intimate relationship.
What were you like when I was 25? Well, I was obsessed. 25, so that would have been 87. I'd been in graduate school for 2 years. Well, you know, when I was 25 or so, I probably weighed about 138 pounds. I smoked like a pack of cigarettes a day. I drank tremendous amount of alcohol. My friends were heavy drinkers, and most of them dropped out of school by the time they were 15 or 16, went off to work on oil rigs, and you know, it was a rough town, and we drank a lot. And I started when I was 14, and I had a lot of bad habits, and I wasn't in great shape physically, and I was also still intellectually obsessed by, as I am now. So, that would have been in 85, but I decided around then, about 85, 84, something like that, maybe a little earlier, that I was really going to try to get my act together. And so I started doing that. First of all, I quit smoking. Well, that took a long time because I eventually had to quit drinking too in order to quit smoking. And I started working out, started playing sports, which I'd never done. I was a small kid. I'd been skipped a grade, and I was small for my age, so sports were never, especially team sports, were never really a domain of expertise for me. Although I skied and went trapping with my dad, trapping with my dad, trapping with my trapping with my trapping with my dad, trapping with my dad, trapping with my dad, trapping with my trapping with my trapping with my dad. Dropping with my dad, dropping with my dad, dropping with my dropping with my dropping with my dad, dropping with my dad, dropping with my dad, dropping with my dropping with my dropping with my dropping with my dad, dropping with my dad, dropping with my dropping with my dropping with my dad. The sons of Noah that went forth of the ark were Shem and Ham and Japheth. And Ham is the father of Canaan.
These are the three sons of Noah, and of them was the whole earth overspread. And Noah began to be a husbandman, and he planted a vineyard. And he drank of the wine and was drunken, and he was uncovered within his tent. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father, and told his two brethren without. And Shem and Japheth took a garment and laid it upon both their shoulders, and went backward, and covered the nakedness of their father, and their faces were backward, and they saw not their father's nakedness. And Noah awoke from his wine, and knew what his younger son had done unto him. And he said, Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants shall he be unto his brethren. And he said, Blessed shall be the Lord God of Shem, and Canaan shall be his servant. And God shall enlarge Japheth, and he shall dwell in the tents of Shem, and Canaan shall be his servant. And Noah lived after the flood 350 years, and all the days of Noah were 950 years, and he died. And the whole earth was of one language and of one speech. I remember thinking about this story. It's got to be 30 years ago. And I think the meaning of the story stood out for me. Sometimes, when you read complicated material, sometimes a piece of it will stand out. It's like it glitters, I suppose. That might be one way of thinking about it. You're in sync with it, and you can understand what it means. And I think I understood what this part of the story of Noah meant. You know, we talked a little bit about what nakedness meant in the story of Adam and Eve. The idea essentially was that to know yourself naked is to become aware of your vulnerability, your physical boundaries in time and space, and your fundamental physiological insufficiencies as they might be judged by others. So there's biological insufficiency that's sort of built into you because you're a fragile, mortal, vulnerable, half-insane creature, and that's just an existential truth. And then, of course, as a human being, even with all those faults, there are faults that you have that are particular to you that will definitely be judged harshly by the group. And so to become aware of your nakedness is to become self-conscious, and that's what is revealed to Ham when he comes across his father naked. And so the question is, what does it mean to see your father naked? And especially in an inappropriate manner like this, it's as if Ham, he's insufficiently respectful of his father. And the question is exactly, what does the father represent? And you can say, well, there's the father that you have, and that's a human being, that's a man like other men. But then there's the father as such, and that's the spirit of the father. And insofar as you have a father, you have both at the same time. You have the personal father, that's a man among other men, just like anyone else's father. But insofar as that man is your father, that means that he's something different than just another person. And what he is the incarnation of the spirit of the Father. And to see that, to disrespect that carelessly, Noah makes a mistake, right? He produces wine and gets himself drunk. And you might say, well, you know, if he's sprawled out there for everyone to see, it's hardly Ham's fault if he stumbles across him. But the book is laying out a danger. And the danger is that maybe you catch your father at his most vulnerable moment. And if you're disrespectful, then you transgress against the spirit of the Father. And if you transgress against the spirit of the Father and lose respect for the spirit of the Father, then that is likely to transform you into a slave. That's a very interesting idea. It's particularly germane, I think, to our current cultural situation, because I think that we're pushed constantly to see the nakedness of our Father, so to speak, because of the intense criticism that's directed towards our culture and the patriarchal culture, so to speak. We're constantly exposing its weaknesses and vulnerabilities and, let's say, nakedness. There's nothing wrong with criticism, but the thing about criticism is the purpose of criticism is to separate the wheat from the chaff. It's not to burn everything to the ground, right? It's to say, well, we're going to carefully look at this. We're going to carefully differentiate. We're going to keep what's good, and we're going to move away from what's bad. But the point of the criticism isn't to identify everything as bad. It's to separate what's good from what's bad so that you can retain what's good and move towards it. And to be careless at that is deadly, because you're inhabited by the Spirit of the Father, right? Insofar as you're a cultural construction, which to be disrespectful towards that means to undermine the very structure that makes you not all of what you are, certainly a good portion of what you are. If you pull the foundation out from underneath that, what do you have left? You can hardly manage on your own. It's just not possible. You're a cultural creation. And so Ham makes this desperate error and is careless about exposing himself to the vulnerability of his father, something like that. He does it without sufficient respect. And the judgment is that not only will he be a slave, but so will all of his descendants. And he's contrasted with the other two sons who, I suppose, are willing to give their father the benefit of the doubt, something like that. And so when they see him in a compromising position, they handle it with respect and don't capitalize on it. And maybe that makes them strong. That's what it seems to me. And so I think that's what that story means. It has something to do with respect. 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 You know, and the funny thing about having respect for your culture, and I suppose that's partly why I'm doing the biblical stories, is because they're part of my culture. They're part of our culture, perhaps, but they're certainly part of my culture. And it seems to me that it's worthwhile to treat that with respect, to see what you can glean from it, and not kick it when it's down, let's say. And so that's how the story of Noah ends, you know. And the thing too is Noah is actually a pretty decent incarnation of the Spirit of the Father, which I suppose is one of the things that makes Ham's misstep more egregious, is that, I mean, Noah just built an ark and got everybody through the flood, man, you know, it's not so bad. And so maybe the fact that he happened to drink too much wine one day wasn't enough to justify humiliating him. And you know, I don't think it's pushing the limits of symbolic interpretation to note on a daily basis that we're all contained in an ark, right? And that's the ark that, you can think about that as the ark that's been bequeathed to us by our forefathers. That's the tremendous infrastructure that we inhabit, that we take for granted, because it works so well, that protects us from things that we can't even imagine, and we don't have to imagine because we're so well protected. And it does seem to me that anyone who lives in the West, in the Western culture at this time in history and in this place, and who isn't simultaneously grateful for that, is half blind, at least, because it's never been better than this, and it could be so much worse. It's never been better than this, and it could be so much worse. It's never been better than this, and it could be so much worse. It's never been better than this, and it could be so much worse. 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 And it's highly likely that it will be so much worse, because for most of human history, so much worse is the norm. I got married. Well, the woman who's my wife, Tammy, who I've known since she was 8 years old, she lived across the street from me in this little town called Fairview, and I was in love with her like the first time I saw her, which is quite a bloody thing. So that's worked out pretty well for me. But she came to live with me about the same time, and you know, we decided jointly to get our act together, and we swore that we tell each other the truth, which I think she's actually done better than me. Like I don't think she's lied to me ever in our entire marriage, which is unbelievable. It's been so useful because I can really tell her things and we can really talk. So I tell you, if you want to have a good relationship, man, you embed it in the truth, because if you don't embed it in the truth, you don't have a relationship. It's just lies. It's a tissue of lies, and it will dissolve in the chaos as soon as a crisis comes along. So the truth is a terrible thing, but not compared to falsehood. Even something as simple as like eye contact in a situation where there's a possibility of finding a sexual partner is a very important component of that, because eye contact indicates interest, and it also indicates, at least in principle, the possibility of approach. And so approach is dopaminergically mediated, and it's a positive emotional state. And that's also why, interestingly enough, if you go into a pharmacy and there's a rack of magazines, what's on the cover? Beautiful woman. Beautiful woman. Beautiful woman. On 50% of the men's magazines, there's a beautiful woman, and on like 100% of the women's magazines, which is really interesting, you know, because you might think, well, why is that? And the woman's eyes are always looking out in a way that they're looking at you. It's an invocation of interest. And so, you know, magazines evolve. All the ones that don't get bought fail. And so what's happened is they all converge to the same point. And the same point is the thing that's maximally interesting to a magazine purchaser is a beautiful female face, whether it's male or female. And we also know that, for example, with men, if you show them, this is a funny little study, so you show them the face of a beautiful woman and her eyes are looking that way or this way, or they're looking right at him. You can check the activity in the dopaminergic center in a place called the nucleus accumbens, which is the same place that cocaine hits. Face on eye contact, that thing lights up. It lights up even more if she's wearing a red dress. Right, and you can get the same kind of lighting up with a red curvy sports car. So it's, you know, my question. I'm not exactly sure why. Oh, that's wrong. I do know why red. Ripe fruit. Women have co-evolved with ripe fruit. It's very sneaky of you, by the way. So that's why you know that. You just have to leaf through a women's magazine, and the lipstick is always associated with like apples that are glistening in some way, or a peach or something like that. And we were primarily fruit eaters. And the reason we have color vision is to detect fruit. Also, part of the reason that fruit turns red or color when it ripens is because the fruit that was successfully eaten by creatures that distributed the seeds was the fruit that was ripe when it was eaten. And so as the color vision evolved, maybe there was a red tint for God only knows what reason, then a positive feedback loop developed, and fruit got redder and redder, and at the same time, women capitalized on that. That's partly, I think, what explains the association between Eve and the apple in Genesis, because Genesis is also a story about gaining sight. So, yeah, so that's why red. So that's pretty funny. I really think that's pretty funny. So, you know, evolved sensory significance is absolutely everywhere, you know. It's so deep inside of us. And it's funny, too, because, say, there's a flushed face. Well, that means it's infused with love. It's also a sign of health. It's also a sign of sexual arousal. but it is a sign of hell. And so you see, in old Coke ads from the 1930s, the girl's cheeks are so red that, you know, it looks like she has a fever. So it's often a form of sexual signaling that indicates health. So that's another part. I mean, these are multiply determined, right? It is anything as complex as vision. Yeah, and blood means, hey, maybe don't go there. Or maybe it means there's something to eat.
I think it was called. It was me and this like really overweight kid, and like these 60-year-old women and men, they could out exercise me like mad. It was really embarrassing. Me and the overweight kid, you know, we'd be just panting ourselves 3/4 to death at the end of the bloody workout, and these 60-year-old women who weren't in great shape were like, you know, chatting away as if nothing was going on at all in the pool. So that was quite embarrassing, and as was going to the weight room. You know, because when I started, I could barely bench press 75 pounds, and people used to keep coming over and helping me, which was the last thing I bloody well wanted, but certainly needed. And I got to the point where I could bench press 225 pounds. I think that was the best I did, and I gained about 30 pounds of muscle in a year and a half. So that was a good thing. So, like, I was kind of a wild man, and, you know, I'm a little bit manic in my temperament, and so I was kind of going every direction at the same time. You know, I don't regret that. I had a fine time when I was a kid, but I needed to get disciplined, and I needed to get disciplined, and I needed to get disciplined, and I had to do it because I was working on these hard problems that I've been discussing with all of you, and I've been working on them really obsessively since I was probably about 18, maybe even earlier than that. Got to the point around 25 when I was in graduate school trying to get my PhD. I published 15 papers by the time I graduated, which was I think by a fairly large measure the most papers that any undergraduate student at that time had ever published at McGill. And at the same time I wrote Maps of Meaning, which was a terribly difficult thing to do because I was writing about 3 hours a day doing that, and I couldn't do all that and continue with my misbehavior, you know, my sort of, my, what would you say, my massive hedonistic consumption of alcohol and all of that. I just couldn't keep it up, and also work seriously on the issues that were at hand. So I had to stop. That's a sacrifice. I had to stop messing about and straighten myself out.
Every social animal, and even many animals who aren't social, are embedded in a dominance hierarchy. The dominance hierarchy has a structure. We couldn't call it a dominance hierarchy. Dominance hierarchy A, B, C, thousands of them across thousands of years. What's central to all of them? That's the pyramid of value. What question do you need answered about the pyramid of value? What's at the top? Because that's the ideal. That's the eye at the top of the pyramid, or the golden Buddha in the lotus. It's the same thing. It's the same thing as the crucifix. And that has to do with something like the voluntary acceptance and therefore transcendence of suffering. 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 The voluntary acceptance and therefore transcendence of suffering. These are not arbitrary ideas. They're deeply, deeply, deeply rooted in biology and culture. They're as deeply rooted in biology as the dominance hierarchy is rooted in biology. And we already know the answer to that. The dominance hierarchy has been around for 350 million years. It's a long time. You don't get to just brush that off and say, well, morality is some sort of second-order cognitive problem. It's like, no, it's not. You have a counter at the bottom of your brain that keeps track of where you are in terms of your status, and it bloody well regulates the sensitivity of your emotions. So if you're at the bottom of the hierarchy, barely clinging on to the world, everything overwhelms you, and that's because you're damn near dead. And so everything should overwhelm you. You've got no extra resources. You're sunk. And if you're nearer the top, then your serotonin levels go up, you're less sensitive to negative emotion, you're less impulsive, you live longer, everything works in your favor. Your immune system functions better, and you're oriented at least to some degree towards the medium and long-term future. And you can afford that because all hell isn't breaking loose around you all the time. And so then the question is there a way of being that increases the probability that you're going to move up dominance hierarchies? Well, that doesn't seem to be a particularly provocative proposition. Okay, so back to Jung. See, Jung believed that once we had stopped populating the cosmos with gods, that they went inside. Think about it this way. Archaic person looks at the sky, uses his imagination to populate the sky. What's the sky? Well, it's the constellations. It's the domain of the gods. Well, why? Because the gods are what are out there beyond your understanding. Well, that's what you see when you look up at the sky. So you populate the night sky with figures of your imagination. So the gods are the things that you broadcast out of your imagination and see spread over the world. It's like the contents of your unconscious are manifesting themselves when you encounter the unknown. It's exactly what it is. How else could it be? You're projecting your fantasy onto what you don't understand. That's how you start to cope with what you don't understand. You populate the unknown with deities. Where did they come from? They came from your imagination. Well, what happens when you take them out of the world? Do they disappear? No. They just go back into your imagination. That's the same motif as rescuing your dead father from the belly of the whale. Belly of the whale. Belly of the whale. Rescuing your dead father from the belly of the whale. Belly of the whale. Belly of the whale. It's the same idea. Is that the corpses of the gods inhabit your imagination. So where do you go if you need to revivify them? You go into your imagination. I was at the Museum of Art in New York. I was in this amazing room. You know, it had all these priceless paintings from the late Renaissance hanging in it. Each painting worth, who knows, $1 billion maybe. They're priceless paintings. So the room was, it's a shrine, and it was full of people from all over the world who were looking at these paintings. You think, well, what the hell are these people doing coming to this room looking at these paintings? Like, what are they up to? What are they doing? They don't know what that means. Like, why are they looking at that painting? Why is it in this room? Why does it cost $1 billion? Why is that painting worth so much? And the answer to that is, well, we don't really know. They're sacred objects in some sense, and we gaze at them in ignorance and wonder. And the reason for that is that the unknown shines through them at us in partially articulated form. Well, that's the role of art. And that's the role of artists, you know? And real artists are contending with the unknown, right? And they're possessed by it. They have a personality trait, openness, that makes them do that. They can't even help it. The worst thing for creative people is to not be creative because they just die. So one of the things I would say is buy a damn piece of art, you know? Find one that really speaks to you and look out if you do it. If it's a real piece of art, because you'll also get a little introduction to the artist, and then that'll seep into your life, and that'll change things like mad. But it's unbelievably worth it, because it opens your eyes to the domain of the transcendent. That's the right way of thinking about it. A real piece of art is a window into the transcendent. That's what it is. You can see that integral to our culture is the idea that beauty is one pathway towards God. And if you can't find another pathway, then why don't you use beauty? I'm sure most of you do that with music, because music is the one thing that modern people can't be cynical about. Thank God for that. And so we need to understand the role of art and literature and stop thinking about it as an option. It's not an option. It's not an option. What has it said? Man does not live by bread alone. That's exactly right. We live by beauty. We live by literature. We live by art. And literally, not metaphorically. We cannot live without it, because life is too dismal and tragic in the absence of the sublime.
Akira.
So, thank you very much, and I hope that you find these programs that we're developing useful and practical, and that they help you put yourselves together and lead productive and meaningful and high-quality lives with the least amount of tragedy and suffering possible. That would be really good. So, thanks very much.
That's true. There's no way you're going to find out whether or not that's true unless you do it. You have to be all in this game. It's like what happens at the
beginning of the story of Pinocchio is that Geppetto wishes on a star. So what Geppetto does is align himself with the metaphorical manifestation of the highest good he can conceptualize. He aims at the star. And for him, the star is the possibility that he can take his creation, a puppet, whose strings are being pulled by unseen forces, and have it transform into something that's autonomous and real. Well, that's a hell of an ambition. You know, and we're wise enough to put that in a children's movie, but too foolish to understand what it means. It's such an interesting juxtaposition that we can both know that and not know it at the same time. You can go to the movie, you can watch it, and it makes sense. But that doesn't mean that you can go home and think, well, I know what that meant. Well, people are complicated, right? We exist at different levels, and all the levels don't communicate with one another. But the movie is a hypothesis, and the hypothesis is there's no better pathway to self-realization and the ennoblement of being than to posit the highest good that you can conceive of and commit yourself to it. And then you might also ask yourself, and this is definitely worth asking, is do you really have anything better to do? And if you don't, then why would you do anything else?
Therefore, take no thought for the morrow, for the morrow shall take thought for the things of itself. Sufficient unto the day is the evil thereof.
I spent a long time trying to figure out what that meant too, because it's another one of those lines that can easily be read as pro-grasshopper and anti-ant. Remember the old fable of the grasshopper and the ant? Maybe not. I'm not going to tell it, but the ant works and the grasshopper fiddles. And the ant has a pretty good time in the winter and the grasshopper dies. This is like a pro-grasshopper line, but it's not. It says something else. It says that if you orient yourself properly and then pay attention to what you do every day, that works. That works. That works. I actually think that that's in accordance with what we have come to understand about human perception, because what happens is that the world shifts itself around your aim. You're a creature that has an aim. You have to have an aim in order to do something. You're an aiming creature. You look at a point and you move towards it. It's built right into you. And so you have an aim. Well, let's say your aim is the highest possible aim. Well, then, so that sets up the world around you. It organizes all of your perceptions. It organizes what you see and you don't see. It organizes your emotions and your motivations. So you organize yourself around that aim. And then what happens is the day manifests itself as a set of challenges and problems. And if you solve them properly, then you stay on the pathway towards that aim. And you can concentrate on the day. And so that way you get to have your cake and eat it too. Because you can point into the distance, the far distance. And you can live in the day. Live in the day. Live in the day. And you can live in the day. That makes every moment of the day supercharged with meaning, because if everything that you're doing every day is related to the highest possible aim that you can conceptualize, well, that's the very definition of the meaning that would sustain you in your life. Well, and then the issue is back to Noah. Well, all hell's about to break loose and chaos is coming. It's like when that's happening in your life, you might want to be doing something that you regard as truly worthwhile, because that's what will keep you afloat when everything is flooded. And you don't want to wait until the flood comes to start doing that, because if your ark's half built and you don't know how to captain it, the probability is very high that you'll drown. I'm quite enamored of lobsters, as some of you might know, because I found out, this just blew me away when I found it out, just exactly how much continuity there was in the neurochemistry of human beings and the neurochemistry of animals. It's absolutely staggering. It's the sort of thing that makes the fact of evolution something like self-evident. Random mutation and natural selection is the only way you can solve the problem of how to deal with an environment that's complex beyond your ability to comprehend.
I think what you do is you generate endless variants because God only knows what the hell's going to happen next. Almost all of them die because they're failures, and a couple propagate. And the environment keeps moving around like a giant snake. You never know what it's going to do next. And so the best you can do is say, well, here's 30 things that might work, and 28 of them are going to perish. Anyways, back to the lobsters. So these creatures engage in dominance disputes. So it really is the toughest lobster that wins. And what's so cool about the lobster is that when a lobster wins, he flexes and gets bigger. So he looks bigger because he's a winner. It's like he's advertising that. And the neurochemical system that makes him flex is serotonergic. And you think, well, who cares? What the hell does that mean? I'll tell you what it means. It's the same chemical that's affected by antidepressants in human beings. And so, like, if you're depressed, you're a defeated lobster. Like, you're like this. I'm small. Things are dangerous. I don't want to fight. You give somebody an antidepressant, it's like they stretch, and then they're ready to take on the world again. Well, if you give lobsters who just got defeated in a fight serotonin, then they stretch out and they'll fight again. And that's we separated from those creatures on the evolutionary timescale somewhere between 350 and 600 million years ago, and the damn neurochemistry is the same. And so that's another indication of just how important hierarchies of authority are. Okay, so here's the problem. There's a big problem here.